Hey everyone, Father Lane here. I'm glad to have you here for another class in our course on the prophets. And today you can see we are at Citi Field in Queens, New York. Actually, we're on the platform for the 7 train right outside of Citi Field in Queens, New York, but that's beside the point. We're close to the Statue of Liberty, which of course was erected to call all immigrants, especially to the United States, and to celebrate the gift of freedom. It's appropriate because today's topic is all about freedom. The former prophets, sometimes called the Deuteronomistic history, they're the same thing, are all about how did Israel inherit freedom in its land, how can it maintain freedom in its land, and sadly, how did it lose freedom in its land? These 4 books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, form a coherence with one another. They tell the story first of how Israel entered the land, that's the book of Joshua, how they struggled, that's the book of Judges, how they eventually found unity under a king, that's the book of Samuel, and how that kingship eventually frayed, led to a schism between a northern and a southern kingdom, and then eventually had both kingdoms end up in exile. The Deuteronomistic history tells this story. In this video, we're going to look at 3 questions. First, what's the Deuteronomistic history about? And then second, where did it come from? And then third, is it a history or is it prophecy? Remember earlier we talked about how in the Christian tradition these are called historical books, whereas in the Hebrew tradition these are called prophetic books. Spoiler alert, the answer is going to be a version of both. We'll get to that, but for now, what are these books about? First and foremost, we can take a survey, what we scholars will call a synchronic survey. That is, we simply read the text as it exists in its final form, and we seek to see what is the inspired author emphasizing. What do we notice on our first reading? And I'd like to appeal to a key contrast that we sometimes use when we read narrative books, this distinction between narrative time and narration time. As you can see on your screen, narrative time is measured in conventional units of time. Years, days, hours, minutes, seconds, the kind of clock time that we measure conventionally with units of time. Narrative time describes the amount of clock time that is covered within a given story. How much clock time elapses within the story. By contrast, narration time, which is measured in units of text amount, chapters, words, sentences, paragraphs, verses, in the case of poetry, lines. How much text is used to narrate a given story. This ratio between narration time and narrative time can produce an effect and draw us to focus on what does the inspired author focus his attention on. A lot of text means there's a lot of attention there, whereas not a lot of text and a lot of clock time gives us the sense of he's glossing over it. So we look at this chart here, and I'll confess this chart is an approximation. Especially with Joshua and Judges, it's very difficult to determine how much clock time is actually elapsing within the story, but it works. You'll notice in green, these are the sections that we might call fast passages. These are sections where a lot of time gets covered and not a lot of text. It has a quick tempo. Whereas in yellow, the story slows down. We focus on one character in grave detail. Joshua, Saul, Samuel, David, Solomon, Elijah, Elisha, Hezekiah, Josiah. These are characters that the inspired author wants our attention on. And why does the inspired author want our attention on these characters? Because for the most part, they are heroes. Joshua and Josiah are archetypal, faithful men. They're the great heroes of these books. Hezekiah too. Also Deborah is a heroine in the book of Judges. Gideon also. He's not called a prophet, but as we'll see when we look more in detail at the book of Judges, he shares some of those prophetic characteristics. Samuel and Elijah and Elisha also major heroes. Note also the villains. Jeroboam causes the schism and leads the northern kingdom into idolatry. He's one of the great villains. Manasseh leads the southern kingdom into idolatry. Ahab and Jezebel, of course, are wicked characters. Also Abimelech is not particularly well known, but he's a king in the book of Judges. We'll look at him a little bit later. Saul and Solomon are, some might disagree, especially with Solomon being characterized as a villain, but I think it's warranted with how he's treated in Kings, not to be confused with Chronicles or some other books of the Old Testament. But both Saul and Solomon are treated as tragic figures, men whom God gives much, but squander it. And then we had just complicated characters. David, of course, we might think of as a hero, yet he has a couple of really major failures. Jephthah and Samson in the book of Judges, also characters who do some great good, but have some real tragic flaws. One of the main themes of the historical books is to explain, why did the exile happen? Why do bad things happen? And here's where the inspired author stops telling the story and tells us explicitly what his values are. Here, the Deuteronomistic historian gives us what he believes the cause to be of the effect that is the exile. He says in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 7, "This," meaning the exile, "came about because the Israelites sinned against the Lord. They followed the rites of the nations whom the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and those that the kings of Israel had practiced." In other words, for the Deuteronomistic historian, God brought the people into the land, and God can, and in fact did, kick them out when they sinned. But there's more. A little later in the same chapter, all of this is describing how the northern kingdom was led into exile by Assyria in 722 BC. 2 Kings says, "The Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and seer, 'Give up your evil ways, and keep my commandments and statutes in accordance with the entire law which I enjoined on your ancestors and which I sent you by my servants the prophets.'" Note the prominence of the prophets, and how the prophets, at least at the time that the inspired author is writing, had largely been ignored. So that's the answer to our first question. What's it about? It's the tragedy of how Israel squandered God's grace. So let's move to our second question. Where did this come from? Traditionally, these books were attributed to Joshua, Samuel, and the prophet Jeremiah, and there can be some truth to that. There's reason to believe that Jeremiah may well have had a hand, especially in some of the early drafts of the historical books. But today, scholars recognize that it was a little more complicated than that. In recent decades, we see 4 different stages of what we call redaction, 4 stages of editing. You had some primary sources that are very old, and then there was King Josiah's era. But then the book was supplemented during the time of the exile, and then after the exile, when the people came back to the land, we have the version that we now have in our Bibles today, and which was used by the chronicler who wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Finally, our third question. Is the Deuteronomistic history or prophecy? Who's right, the Christian tradition or the Hebrew tradition? And the answer I would suggest to you is both. You can see on your screen here that it has some historical characteristics. It's a narrative about the past. That's history in some sense, especially when read in light of what ancient historiography was like. No one would confuse the Deuteronomistic history with the kind of history produced by a modern university department of history. But there's also some allusions to sources. Much like a modern historian would do, we see the Deuteronomistic historian alluding to some other books. He alludes to them in Joshua 10:13, 2 Kings 21:17, and other places besides. He also, like a modern historian, seeks to articulate cause-effect relationships. X happened because of Y. We saw that in that passage from 2 Kings 17 we were just looking at. By the same token, it's also prophetic. Notice first the emphasis on the role of the prophets, whether it's Deborah in the book of Judges, whether it's Samuel in the book of Samuel, or Nathan or Gad in Samuel, also in Kings, and of course Elijah and Elisha in the book of Kings. Prophets have a prominent role. Also, like the prophets, these books seek to persuade the people to obey the word of the Lord. As we said earlier, the prophet is before anything else an agent of the word of the Lord. Insofar as these books are carrying the word of the Lord and calling people to faithfulness to it, they are prophetic. And finally, over the centuries after its composition, it was received as a prophetic book. In the New Testament, Elijah is the great archetype of a prophet. Hence, he's present at the Transfiguration. Also, if you compare that passage we just looked at in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 13, with the story of Jesus arguing with the scholars of the law in Luke chapter 11, 47 through 50, the resemblance is striking. Of course, there's much more to be said about these books, and the good news is that we're going to spend the next several videos going in depth with Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. I look forward to seeing you there. Until then, read well and pray well.